Have you ever looked in the mirror and quietly wondered, what happened to me? Not because you failed once, not because life knocked you down, but because somewhere along the way you stopped believing in yourself. You stopped trusting your own voice. You stopped seeing your own worth. And every day became a battle between who you are and who you used to dream of becoming. If that's where you are right now, then don't click away, because what you're about to hear could change the way you see yourself forever. Most people think giving up happens in a single moment. It doesn't. Giving up happens quietly. It happens when you convince yourself that you're too late, too broken, too tired, too far behind. It happens when disappointment becomes your identity, when fear becomes your advisor, when the voice inside your head starts telling you that nothing will ever change. But what if that voice is lying? What if the person you've been trying to escape is actually the person who needs your compassion the most? Today, we're going to explore a timeless message about healing, self-acceptance, resilience, and the incredible power hidden within the human heart. Because the truth is this: you do not need to become someone else to be worthy. You do not need to earn your right to exist. And you do not need to have everything figured out before you start believing in yourself again. The journey back to yourself doesn't begin with perfection. It begins with one courageous decision: the decision to stop abandoning yourself. So before you give up, before you decide that it's over, before you convince yourself that you're not enough, listen carefully. This message may be exactly what your heart has been waiting to hear. There is something most people never understand about an empath until it's too late. They see the kindness. They see the patience. They see the willingness to listen, to help, to show up when things get difficult. But what they don't see is the cost. They don't see the emotional energy being spent behind every encouraging word, every late night conversation, every moment of understanding. They don't see the silent sacrifices. And because they don't see them, they begin to assume they'll always be there. Think about that for a moment. The people who give the most are often the people everyone worries about the least. Why? Because they seem strong. They seem calm. They seem capable of carrying everything. They become the person everyone leans on, the person everyone calls, the person everyone expects to understand. And over time, what was once appreciated becomes expected. That's where the danger begins. Because there is a massive difference between being valued and being used. At first, the line is hard to see. Even the empath may not notice it. They continue giving because that's what they do. They continue showing compassion because that's who they are. They convince themselves that people are busy, that people are struggling, that people don't mean any harm. So they keep pouring and pouring and pouring, until one day they look around and realize something painful. They're always there for everyone else, but almost nobody is there for them. An empath rarely complains about this in the beginning. They don't keep score. They don't demand repayment. They don't help people because they're expecting a reward. They help because they genuinely care. They care deeply. Sometimes more deeply than is good for them. But even the strongest heart has limits. Imagine carrying a bucket of water every day and handing out a little to everyone you meet. One person needs encouragement. Another needs support. Another needs forgiveness. Another needs understanding. Day after day, year after year, you keep giving from that bucket. Now imagine nobody ever asks whether your bucket is full. Nobody asks if you're tired. Nobody asks what you're carrying. Eventually, that bucket runs dry. The tragedy is that many empaths don't realize they're exhausted until they've reached their breaking point. They've become so accustomed to meeting everyone else's emotional needs that they've forgotten how to recognize their own. And here's what most people miss. The empath isn't hurt because they gave. They're hurt because their giving became invisible. Their kindness became ordinary. Their sacrifices became expected. The very thing that made them special became something people felt entitled to receive. Have you ever noticed how people often take the most reliable person for granted? They assume they'll understand. They assume they'll forgive. They assume they'll stay. That's exactly what happens. The empath becomes a permanent fixture in everyone's life, so permanent that people stop appreciating their presence. They stop noticing the effort. They stop recognizing the value. And appreciation is more important than many people realize, not because the empath needs constant praise, but because appreciation communicates something powerful. It says, I see you. It says, I recognize what you're doing. It says, you matter too. Without that recognition, a painful loneliness begins to grow, not the loneliness of being physically alone, the loneliness of feeling emotionally unseen. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely invisible. You can be loved and still feel unappreciated. You can be needed by everyone and understood by no one. That kind of loneliness changes people, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The empath starts noticing patterns they once ignored. They notice who only calls when they need something. They notice who disappears when they're struggling. They notice who expects endless understanding but offers very little in return. And every observation becomes another weight on their heart. The interesting thing is that they usually won't confront anyone immediately. That's not their nature. They'll give more chances, then more chances after that, then even more chances because they believe in people. They believe people can change. They believe people can become better. But eventually reality becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually they realize they're participating in relationships that are one-sided. Relationships where they're pouring from an empty cup. Relationships where their value is measured only by what they provide. And something inside them begins to shift, not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly. The phone calls become shorter. The messages become less frequent. The emotional investment starts fading. People often mistake this for coldness. It isn't. It's exhaustion. It's the result of carrying emotional burdens for too long without support. It's the result of giving endlessly without receiving even basic consideration. And here's what makes this so heartbreaking. Most people don't notice the change when it's happening. They're too accustomed to receiving. They're too focused on their own needs. They assume everything is fine because the empath hasn't complained. But silence does not mean everything is okay. Sometimes silence is the final stage of disappointment. Sometimes silence is what happens when someone has explained their pain so many times that they no longer believe anyone is listening. An empath doesn't usually leave after one betrayal. They don't disappear after one mistake. They disappear after 1,000 moments that seem insignificant on their own, a forgotten promise, an ignored feeling, a one-sided conversation, a lack of gratitude, a lack of effort, a lack of care, tiny moments, tiny wounds, tiny disappointments, each one adding up over time, until the person who once fought to keep the connection alive no longer has the energy to fight. And when that moment arrives, it surprises everyone. Because from the outside, it seems sudden. People say things like, I don't know what happened. I thought everything was fine. They just changed. But the truth is, nothing changed overnight. The signs were there all along. The empath was slowly fading, slowly withdrawing, slowly learning that not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. And once they reach that understanding, something powerful happens. They stop chasing people who don't value them. They stop proving their worth. They stop sacrificing themselves to maintain relationships that only survive because of their effort. For the first time, they choose themselves, not from anger, not from resentment, but from wisdom, because they finally understand that kindness does not require self-abandonment. Love does not require self-sacrifice. And caring for others should never come at the cost of caring for yourself. That's the moment people mistake for disappearance. But in reality, the empath isn't disappearing. They're returning to themselves. They're reclaiming the energy they gave away for years. They're protecting the heart that everyone expected to remain open no matter how much it was neglected. And once they reach that point, getting them back becomes incredibly difficult because they didn't leave impulsively. They left after exhausting every reason to stay. Trust is a strange thing. It cannot be forced. It cannot be demanded. It cannot be bought. And once it's broken enough times, it becomes one of the hardest things in the world to rebuild. For an empath, trust is not just about believing someone's words. It goes much deeper than that. It is about feeling safe in someone's presence. It is about believing that the person standing in front of them is the same person standing behind them. It is about consistency between what is said and what is done. An empath pays attention to details that most people overlook. They notice changes in tone. They notice hesitation in a voice. They notice when someone's energy feels different, even when their smile looks the same, while others are listening to words. An empath is often listening to what exists underneath those words. They are constantly reading the emotional environment around them, often without realizing they're doing it. Because of this, deception affects them differently. A person may think they successfully hid a lie. They may believe they covered their tracks. They may assume they avoided consequences because the empath didn't immediately confront them. But the empath often senses that something is wrong long before they have evidence to prove it. And that's where the internal struggle begins. Because empaths naturally want to believe the best in people. They want to trust. They want to give others the benefit of the doubt. They want to believe that honesty exists beneath confusion, mistakes, and misunderstandings. So when something feels off, they don't immediately walk away. Instead, they start questioning themselves. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe there's another explanation. Maybe I should be more understanding. And because they care so deeply, they often extend grace far beyond what most people would tolerate. They offer second chances, then third chances, then fourth chances. Not because they're weak, but because they genuinely hope the person will choose honesty. The problem is that repeated dishonesty creates a wound that grows deeper with every incident. The first lie creates doubt. The second creates suspicion. The third creates distance. And eventually trust begins to crumble beneath the weight of disappointment. What many people fail to understand is that the lie itself is often not the biggest problem. The bigger problem is what the lie communicates. It communicates disrespect. It communicates that the truth wasn't considered important enough. It communicates that manipulation was chosen over honesty. And every time that happens, the empath feels something inside them shift. Not because they're looking for perfection. Empaths understand that human beings make mistakes. They understand fear. They understand insecurity. They understand why people sometimes hide things. What they struggle to accept is repeated dishonesty after trust has already been given, because trust is sacred to them. When an empath opens their heart to someone, they are offering something valuable. They are offering vulnerability. They are offering emotional access. They are offering a level of connection that many people spend years searching for. And when that gift is mishandled, it leaves a lasting mark. Imagine building a bridge between two people. Every honest conversation becomes another plank. Every kept promise becomes another support beam. Every moment of integrity strengthens the structure. Trust grows stronger over time, but every lie removes a piece of that bridge. Every betrayal weakens its foundation. Every broken promise creates another crack. At some point, the bridge can no longer support the weight of the relationship. And that's exactly what repeated betrayal does. It doesn't destroy trust all at once. It erodes it slowly, piece by piece, moment by moment, until one day the connection that once felt strong feels fragile and uncertain. What's fascinating is that the empath rarely announces this process. They don't usually create dramatic scenes. They don't always issue ultimatums. In fact, many people are completely unaware that they're approaching the end of the empath's patience. From the outside, everything appears normal. The conversations continue. The smiles remain. The relationship seems intact. but internally something is changing. The empath is observing, watching, learning, paying attention. Each broken promise becomes information. Each inconsistency becomes evidence. Each act of dishonesty reveals another piece of the person's character. And over time, a painful realization begins to emerge. The empath starts seeing someone for who they truly are rather than who they hope they would become. That realization can be heartbreaking because empaths often see potential in people. They see goodness hidden beneath flaws. They see possibilities hidden beneath mistakes. They see what someone could become, but eventually reality demands attention. Potential is not character. Promises are not actions. Words are not behavior. And when enough evidence accumulates, the empath can no longer ignore what they see. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume forgiveness means the damage has disappeared. It hasn't. An empath may forgive. In fact, they're often remarkably forgiving. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Forgiveness releases resentment. Trust requires evidence. Forgiveness can happen in a moment. Trust takes time. And once trust has been broken repeatedly, rebuilding it becomes an enormous challenge. Because now the empath isn't listening to promises anymore. They're watching behavior. They're observing patterns. They're paying attention to consistency. And if the behavior remains unchanged, the distance continues growing. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The relationship begins losing its emotional depth. Conversations become more surface level. Vulnerability decreases. Personal sharing becomes limited. The empath starts protecting parts of themselves that were once freely offered, not because they're trying to punish anyone, not because they're seeking revenge, but because experience has taught them caution. The heart naturally protects itself from repeated injury. That's not bitterness, that's wisdom. Many people notice this shift too late. They only become concerned once the empath stops reaching out, once the effort disappears, once the emotional investment fades. Suddenly they want answers. Suddenly they want conversations. Suddenly they want to repair the damage. But by then, the empath has often spent months or even years processing what happened. They've already cried about it. They've already struggled with it. They've already wrestled with the disappointment. While others were assuming everything was fine, the empath was slowly accepting a difficult truth. Trust was dying, and trust rarely dies with noise. It dies in silence. It dies during moments nobody notices. It dies when promises repeatedly go unfulfilled. It dies when honesty becomes optional. It dies when words lose their credibility. The most painful part is that the empath usually wanted things to work. They weren't searching for reasons to leave. They weren't hoping for failure. They were hoping for change. They were hoping for accountability. They were hoping for sincerity. They were hoping the person would recognize the damage and choose a different path. But hope cannot survive indefinitely without evidence. Eventually, there comes a moment when the empath realizes they're holding on to a version of someone that no longer exists, or perhaps never existed at all. And in that moment, something remarkable happens. The chasing stops, the explaining stops, the pleading stops. The attempts to repair what only one person is trying to fix come to an end. Not because the empath stopped caring, but because they finally understand that trust cannot survive on effort from only one side. At that point, their silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. Because when an empath reaches the place where they no longer believe your words, no longer depend on your promises, and no longer expect honesty, where dishonesty has become a pattern, the connection begins fading into the distance. Not with anger, not with drama, not with revenge, but with the quiet certainty that some doors close, not because love disappeared, but because trust did. One of the deepest truths about an empath is this: they can survive hardship, they can survive misunderstanding, they can even survive heartbreak, but they struggle to stay where they feel emotionally unsafe. Because for an empath, safety is not just physical. It is emotional, psychological, and spiritual. It is the feeling that they can be fully themselves without being attacked mocked, dismissed, or manipulated. The moment that safety disappears, something inside them begins to close. And most people never notice it happening. At first, the empath still tries. They still explain. They still communicate their feelings. They still give the relationship the benefit of the doubt. They assume the other person simply does not understand. They assume that with enough honesty, enough patience, enough love, things can improve. So they speak up. They say, "That hurt me." They say, "I don't feel heard." They say, "I need a little more understanding." And what happens next determines everything. If those feelings are met with care, the empath feels safe. But if those feelings are met with ridicule, defensiveness, blame, silence, or emotional punishment, a dangerous message is sent. Your feelings are not welcome here. That message cuts deeper than most people realize, because empaths already spend much of their lives absorbing the emotions of others. They are often the ones making room for everyone else's pain. They listen, they comfort, they understand, they adjust. They soften their words so others feel safe. They carry emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. But when the one place they hoped to be understood becomes the place where they feel judged, something begins to break. Not loudly, quietly, slowly, like a door closing 1 inch at a time. An emotionally unsafe environment rarely begins with one dramatic event. More often, it is a pattern of small moments, a joke made at their expense, a feeling dismissed as too sensitive, a vulnerable confession used against them later, a conversation where they are interrupted, minimized, or blamed, a moment when they needed comfort and received criticism instead. Each incident may seem small on its own, but to an empath, those moments accumulate. They become evidence that opening up may lead to pain instead of connection. And the human heart learns from pain. Imagine touching a hot stove. The first time you are surprised. The second time you are cautious. Eventually, you stop touching it altogether. That is what happens emotionally. The empath begins to associate vulnerability with danger, honesty with punishment, openness with regret. So they adapt, they share less, they hide more, they become careful with their words, not because they have become cold, because they are trying not to get burned again. What makes this especially painful is that empaths often stay longer than they should. They keep hoping the environment will change. They keep believing the other person will finally understand. They keep remembering the good moments and wondering if those moments can return. And because they see the pain in others so clearly, they often excuse behavior that hurts them. Maybe they're stressed. Maybe they're struggling. Maybe they don't realize what they're doing. That compassion is beautiful. But when compassion for others becomes abandonment of self, it turns into a trap. Because an empath can spend years trying to understand someone who is making no effort to understand them. Years trying to create peace in a place that keeps wounding them. Years shrinking themselves so conflict can be avoided. And slowly, they lose touch with their own voice. They stop expressing certain feelings. They stop bringing up certain topics. They stop asking for certain needs to be met. They become smaller and smaller inside a relationship that requires them to disappear in order to stay. That is emotional unsafety at its deepest level. Not just being hurt, feeling that you must hide parts of yourself to avoid being hurt. But here is what many people misunderstand: empaths are not weak. In fact, they often endure far more than most people could imagine. They can tolerate discomfort. They can tolerate imperfection. They can tolerate difficult seasons. What they cannot tolerate forever is a relationship that consistently makes them feel emotionally alone. Because eventually, exhaustion replaces hope. One day they realize they are constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the room, constantly choosing words carefully, constantly avoiding triggers, constantly managing someone else's reactions. And they ask themselves a painful question: why do I feel less safe with the person who is supposed to care about me? That question changes everything. Because once an empath recognizes that their nervous system is constantly in defense mode around someone, they begin to understand that love alone is not enough. Connection is not enough. History is not enough. Chemistry is not enough. Without emotional safety, the relationship becomes a place of survival instead of peace. And empaths crave peace more than almost anything. Not because they want an easy life. Because they spend so much energy feeling the world around them that they desperately need somewhere they can finally exhale. A place where they do not have to defend their feelings. A place where vulnerability is protected. A place where mistakes can be discussed without humiliation. A place where they are loved without having to earn the right to be understood. When they find that kind of safety, they become incredibly loyal. They give deeply. They invest fully. They show up with their whole heart. But when they repeatedly encounter criticism, emotional volatility, manipulation, or dismissal, their loyalty begins to withdraw. Not dramatically, quietly. They stop reaching out first. They stop sharing their inner world. They stop imagining a future built on emotional uncertainty. And here is the part that surprises people most. By the time an empath leaves, they have often already mourned the relationship internally. While the other person thought things were merely going through a rough patch, the empath was slowly grieving the loss of emotional safety. They were grieving the version of the relationship they hoped for, grieving the conversations that never happened, grieving the understanding that never came, grieving the feeling of being truly seen. So when they finally become distant, it can seem sudden. But it was not sudden. It was the result of countless moments where their heart learned that staying open felt dangerous. And once an empath reaches the point where protecting their peace becomes more important than preserving the connection, something shifts permanently. They stop trying to convince people to treat them better. They stop begging to be understood. They stop fighting for a place where they constantly feel emotionally unsafe. Instead, they choose distance, not out of hatred, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. Because they finally understand that the people who truly belong in their life will not require them to abandon themselves in order to stay. And when an empath walks away for that reason, the silence they leave behind is often far more powerful than any argument they could have made. So if there's one thing to remember from all of this, it's that an empath rarely disappears because of one mistake. They rarely walk away because of one argument, one bad day, or one imperfect moment. They leave when a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. They leave when kindness is repeatedly taken for granted. They leave when trust is broken more times than it is honored. And they leave when the place that should feel safe becomes the very place where they feel the most alone. The truth is, empaths don't want perfection. They don't expect people to have all the answers. They don't expect relationships without challenges. What they long for is sincerity, honesty, respect, effort. The simple feeling that their heart is being handled with the same care they give to everyone else's. And perhaps that's the lesson many people learn too late. The strongest people are not always the loudest. The people who stay the longest are not always the people who will stay forever. And the hearts that give the most are often the hearts that suffer in silence. Because while everyone is focused on what the empath provides, very few stop to ask what the empath needs. But eventually they do. Eventually they stop looking outward and start looking inward. Eventually they realize that protecting their peace is not selfish. It's necessary. That choosing themselves is not weakness. It's wisdom. And that walking away from what continually hurts them is not giving up. It's finally waking up. So if you have an empath in your life, appreciate them while they're still there. Listen when they speak. Value what they give. Respect the trust they offer. Because the most dangerous thing you can do is assume they'll always stay. They won't. Not because they stopped caring, but because one day they finally started caring about themselves too. And here's something worth thinking about. Some people leave with anger. Some people leave with tears. Some people leave with dramatic goodbyes. But the people who have truly reached their limit, they leave with peace. No fight, no warning, no explanation, just silence. And once that silence arrives, the person you thought would always understand may already be gone. So before you ask why an empath disappeared, ask yourself a harder question. Did they leave suddenly? Or did you simply stop noticing the pain they were carrying all along? If this message spoke to you, then remember this. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a kind heart, because the people who give the most chances are often the people who eventually give none. And when an empath finally chooses peace over pain, their absence becomes the lesson that their presence was trying to teach all along.